Maria Chun swept the entrance of her small tea shop with the same methodical precision she applied to everything in her life. Each stroke of the broom followed a pattern learned through decades of muscle memory, clearing away the dust and leaves that had accumulated overnight in the doorway of Serenity Tea and Herbs on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Oregon. To anyone watching, she appeared to be exactly what she claimed to be, a quiet, middle-aged woman who had inherited her grandmother's tea business and spent her days brewing delicate blends for customers who valued tradition and tranquility. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning ritual was sacred to Maria. She unlocked the heavy wooden door at exactly 6:30 a.m., turned on the soft instrumental music that drifted through hidden speakers, and began preparing the first batch of jasmine tea that would greet her earliest customers. Her movements were fluid and economical, each gesture serving a purpose, nothing wasted or unnecessary. The townspeople of Cedar Falls had grown accustomed to her quiet efficiency over the past 12 years, but they had no idea that every motion they witnessed was the product of training that had begun before most of them were born. Maria was 52 years old, though she carried herself with the posture and grace of someone 20 years younger. Her black hair, streaked with premature silver, was always pulled back in a simple bun secured with wooden pins. She wore the same uniform every day: dark pants, a cream-colored linen shirt, and a brown apron embroidered with small tea leaves that her grandmother had stitched by hand decades ago. Her customers often commented on how she never seemed to age, how her skin remained smooth despite the years she'd spent working outdoors before taking over the tea shop. They attributed it to good genetics and the healing properties of the herbs she consumed daily, never suspecting the true source of her vitality. The shop itself was a study in understated elegance. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with glass jars containing leaves, roots, and dried flowers from around the world. The aroma that permeated the space was complex and soothing. A blend of chamomile, ginger, green tea, and dozens of other scents that seemed to change with the seasons. Small tables were scattered throughout the main room, each one set with delicate porcelain cups and saucers that had been collected over generations. Natural light filtered through large windows draped with bamboo blinds, creating patterns of shadow and illumination that shifted throughout the day. What the casual observer wouldn't notice was the deliberate arrangement of everything in the space. Every piece of furniture could be moved quickly if necessary. Every exit was kept clear of obstacles. The heavy wooden counter was positioned to provide a clear view of both the front entrance and the back door that led to the alley behind the building. The seemingly decorative walking stick that leaned against the wall near the register was made of ironwood and perfectly balanced for combat use. Maria had spent years creating an environment that appeared welcoming and peaceful while maintaining tactical advantages that most people would never recognize. The basement beneath the tea shop told a different story entirely. Behind a false wall concealed by stacks of tea crates was a room that would have been more familiar in a traditional martial arts academy than in a small-town business. Heavy bags hung from reinforced ceiling beams, their surfaces worn smooth by thousands of hours of practice. Wooden training dummies lined one wall, their arms and bodies scarred from repeated impact. The floor was covered with tatami mats that had been imported from Japan at considerable expense. Along the far wall, weapons racks held an array of traditional training tools: bio staffs, nunchaku, sai, and wooden practice swords, all maintained in perfect condition despite never being used in the presence of others. This hidden dojo was where Maria spent her evenings and early mornings, maintaining skills that she had developed over 30 years of intensive training. Her routine never varied. 2 hours before dawn, every day without exception, she would descend the narrow stairs in practice forms, that had been passed down through generations of masters who had never accepted her as their student. Every technique had been learned through observation, imitation, and countless hours of solitary refinement. Every movement had been perfected through repetition and an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on the supernatural. The irony was not lost on her that she had become more skilled than many of the masters who had rejected her based solely on her gender. In the traditional world of martial arts that she had encountered as a young woman, females were considered unworthy of serious instruction. She had been turned away from dojo after dojo, told repeatedly that her place was in the kitchen or the garden, not on the training floor. The masters who dismissed her had no way of knowing that they were refusing to teach someone who would eventually surpass them all, someone who would develop abilities that transcended the limitations of traditional instruction. Maria's journey had begun in San Francisco's Chinatown, where she had grown up as the daughter of immigrants who owned a small restaurant. Her parents had worked 18-hour days to build their business, leaving her to wander the crowded streets and narrow alleys where different martial arts schools operated behind unmarked doors. She was drawn to the sounds of training, the sharp crack of wooden weapons striking targets, the rhythmic breathing of students practicing forms, the authoritative voices of instructors calling out corrections and encouragement. As a 10-year-old girl, she would press her face against grimy windows, watching in fascination as students moved through sequences that seemed to defy the normal limitations of human movement. Her first rejection came at age 12, when she finally worked up the courage to approach Master Wu, who ran a Wing Chun school above a dim sum restaurant. She had saved money from helping in her parents' kitchen to pay for lessons, carefully counting out crumpled bills and placing them on his desk with trembling hands. Master Wu had looked at her with a mixture of amusement and irritation, speaking in rapid Cantonese to his assistant before switching to heavily accented English. "Little girl," he had said, "this is not place for you. Go home to mother. Learn cooking, not fighting." The pattern repeated itself at school after school. Traditional karate dojos, kung fu academies, taekwondo studios, even the boxing gym where her uncle trained, all closed their doors to her based on assumptions about what young women should and shouldn't do with their lives. Each rejection only strengthened her resolve. If they wouldn't teach her, she would teach herself. If they wouldn't accept her as a student, she would become her own master. She began by watching. For months, she positioned herself where she could observe classes through windows, in doorways, from rooftops when necessary. She memorized every movement, every stance, every technique that she could see. At night, in the cramped apartment, above her parents' restaurant, she would practice what she had learned, moving silently through forms while her family slept. Her body became a repository for knowledge that had been denied to her through conventional channels, storing techniques from a dozen different styles and slowly beginning to synthesize them into something uniquely her own. The breakthrough came when she was 16. A new instructor arrived in Chinatown, a Japanese master named Takeshi, who had studied under some of the most renowned senseis in Okinawa. His reputation preceded him. Students whispered about his legendary skills, his undefeated record in underground competitions, his ability to break boards with strikes that seemed impossibly gentle. Maria watched him for weeks, noting the subtle differences in his approach, the way he emphasized timing and precision over brute force, the almost mystical quality of his movement that made other masters look crude by comparison. Unlike the others, Master Takeshi seemed to sense that he was being observed. During one evening class, as Maria crouched behind a stack of crates in the alley, watching through a gap in the curtains, he suddenly stopped mid-demonstration and looked directly at her hiding spot. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Their eyes met through the window, and for a moment, she was certain he would chase her away or worse, alert her parents to what she had been doing. Instead, he simply nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and continued with his instruction. The next morning, she found a note wedged into the doorframe of her parents' restaurant. Written in precise English on rice paper, it contained a single address and a time: midnight. The location was an abandoned warehouse in a section of the city she had never visited, far from the familiar streets of Chinatown. Against every instinct, for self-preservation, she went. Master Takeshi was waiting for her in the center of an empty room lit by a single hanging bulb. He was smaller than she had expected, perhaps 5 feet 6 inches tall, with graying hair and hands that showed the calluses and scars of decades of training. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried an authority that made her stand straighter without thinking about it. "You have been watching," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," she replied, using the formal address she had heard other students use. "For how long?" 3 years, sir." "Different schools?" He walked around her slowly, studying her posture, her balance, the way she held her hands. "Show me what you have learned." What followed was the most terrifying and exhilarating hour of her young life. Under Master Takeshi's silent observation, she demonstrated every technique she had memorized, every form she had practiced in secret. He made no comments, offered no corrections, simply watched with the intensity of someone evaluating a piece of art or a complex mathematical equation. When she finished, exhausted and sweating despite the cool night air, he nodded once. "You have natural ability," he said. "But more important, you have dedication. Most people want to be taught. You have taught yourself. This is rare." He paused, seeming to consider something. "I cannot take you as a student. My reputation, my standing in the community, would not survive such a scandal. But..." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather journal filled with handwritten notes and diagrams. "Knowledge should not be wasted. Study this. Practice alone. If you have questions, leave them written under the stone by the warehouse door. I will provide answers when I can." That journal became her most treasured possession. It contained detailed explanations of advanced techniques, philosophical discussions about the mental aspects of martial arts, and training regimens that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. Master Takeshi had condensed decades of learning into those pages, creating a curriculum specifically designed for someone who would be studying without direct supervision. The marginalia revealed his own journey, his struggles with masters who had been even more demanding than the ones who had rejected her, his gradual understanding that true martial arts transcended the traditional boundaries of style and gender. For the next 6 years, she followed the program outlined in the journal while maintaining the fiction of a normal teenage life. She graduated from high school, helped her parents expand their restaurant, and even dated occasionally, all while spending every free moment developing abilities that none of her peers could imagine. Her training intensified during the summers, when she could escape to the mountains outside the city and practice without fear of discovery. She learned to move through forest terrain without making a sound, to strike with precision that could stop a charging animal without causing permanent injury, to focus her energy in ways that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Master Takeshi monitored her progress through their covert correspondence, leaving increasingly complex challenges and exercises under their designated stone. He never revealed himself again in person, but his presence was constant her training. Through his guidance, she began to understand that martial arts were not just about fighting techniques, but about achieving a level of mental and physical integration that transformed the practitioner into something beyond ordinary human limitations. The lessons went far beyond combat skills. She learned to read body language with supernatural accuracy, to sense aggression before it manifested in action, to project calm authority that could diffuse volatile situations without violence. Her awareness expanded until she could monitor multiple conversations in a crowded room while appearing to be focused on a single task. Her reflexes became so refined that she could catch falling objects without conscious thought, step aside from collisions that others never saw coming, and maintain perfect balance in situations that would leave normal people sprawling. Most importantly, she learned patience. Traditional martial arts schools produce students who were eager to demonstrate their skills, to compete, to prove their worth through displays of physical prowess. Maria's training taught her that the highest level of skill was often invisible, that true mastery meant never having to reveal one's capabilities unless absolutely necessary. She developed the ability to appear completely ordinary while possessing abilities that bordered on the superhuman. The transformation was not without cost. The isolation required by her secret training meant that she formed few close relationships. Her parents grew concerned about her solitary nature, her reluctance to socialize with other young people, her mysterious disappearances for hours at a time. Friends from school gradually drifted away, unable to connect with someone who seemed to be living in a completely different world. Dating became impossible when potential partners couldn't understand why she was unavailable every evening and weekend for activities they considered normal. By her early 20s, Maria had achieved a level of skill that would have been remarkable in any traditional setting, but she had no way to demonstrate or validate her abilities. The underground fighting circuits that existed in major cities were dominated by men who would never accept challenges from a woman, regardless of her capabilities. Official martial arts competitions required credentials from recognized schools, documentation she could never obtain. She existed in a liminal space between the conventional world and the hidden realm of true martial mastery, belonging fully to neither. The decision to leave San Francisco came after Master Takeshi's death. She found his final message under their stone on a cold morning in November, written in the precise calligraphy she had come to know so well. He had died peacefully in his sleep, he explained, at the age of 87. The warehouse where they had first met would be demolished within the month. Her training was complete, he wrote, but her real education was just beginning. She must now find her own path, create her own purpose, and decide how to use the abilities he had helped her develop. The grief was overwhelming. For 12 years, Master Takeshi had been her only connection to the world of serious martial arts, her guide through challenges that no book or video could have addressed. His death left her feeling untethered, uncertain about how to proceed. With skills that had no obvious application in the ordinary world, she could fight with devastating effectiveness, but she had no enemies. She could defend herself against multiple attackers, but she lived a peaceful life that presented no such threats. She had become a weapon without a target, a solution without a problem. The inheritance from her grandmother provided the answer. The small tea shop in Cedar Falls, Oregon, had been left to her with the expectation that she would continue the family tradition of providing healing herbs and comfort to a small community. Moving to a place where nobody knew her history would give her the opportunity to create a new identity, to build a life that honored her training while serving a useful purpose. She could disappear into the role of a small-town shopkeeper while maintaining her skills in secret, ready for whatever challenges the future might bring. The transition was more difficult than she had anticipated. After years of intensive physical training, the sedentary nature of running a tea shop left her feeling restless and incomplete. The customers were kind but intellectually unstimulating. Their concerns limited to local gossip and minor health complaints that could be addressed with simple herbal remedies. She found herself longing for the intensity of her training sessions, the mental focus required to master new techniques, the satisfaction of pushing her body beyond its apparent limitations. The solution was to recreate her training environment. In the basement of the shop, working at night and on weekends, she constructed a hidden dojo that would allow her to maintain her skills while living her cover life as a peaceful tea merchant. The project took months to complete, requiring her to learn construction techniques, electrical work, and ventilation systems that would keep her activities concealed from neighbors and customers. The result was a training space that rivaled anything she had seen in traditional schools, equipped with everything necessary to continue her development indefinitely. Establishing herself in the community required careful attention to creating the right impression. She needed to be friendly enough to be accepted, but not so outgoing that people would expect her to participate in social activities that might conflict with her training schedule. She had to demonstrate enough knowledge about herbs and traditional medicine to maintain her cover as a tea expert without revealing the depth of her understanding of human physiology and pressure points. Most challenging, she had to suppress the natural confidence and authority that came from her martial arts background, presenting herself as a gentle woman who had chosen the quiet life over more ambitious pursuits. The performance became second nature over the years. She learned to smile at the right moments, to show appropriate interest in local events, to express the mild opinions and harmless preferences that people expected from someone in her position. She joined the Merchants Association, donated to local charities, and even served on the committee that organized the annual Harvest Festival. To everyone in Cedar Falls, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who had found contentment in a simple life surrounded by the healing properties of tea and the peaceful rhythm of small-town existence. But the mask was growing heavier. With each passing year, as she entered her 50s, Maria began to question whether she was wasting abilities that had taken decades to develop. Her physical conditioning remained at peak levels. Her reflexes were as sharp as they had been at 25. Her technical knowledge continued to evolve through study and practice. Yet none of it served any purpose beyond personal satisfaction. She had become the most skilled martial artist in a 100-mile radius, and nobody knew it. The doubts intensified when she encountered the local karate school run by Sensei Robert Harrison, a large man in his 40s who had achieved a third degree black belt through a chain of commercial dojos that emphasized sport competition over traditional values. His school, Mountain View Martial Arts, occupied a converted storefront 3 blocks from her tea shop, and she could hear the sounds of classes through the thin walls whenever she walked past in the evenings. Curiosity eventually overcame caution. She began timing her evening walks to coincide with Harrison's advanced classes, positioning herself where she could observe the instruction through the large windows that faced the street. What she saw confirmed her worst fears about the commercialization of martial arts. Students were learning flashy techniques that would be useless in real combat, developing poor balance and timing, focusing on movements that looked impressive, but lacked the efficiency and precision that defined true martial arts. Harrison himself was the worst example of everything that was wrong with modern instruction. He was clearly out of shape despite his rank, breathing heavily during demonstrations. That should have been effortless for someone of his supposed skill level. His techniques were sloppy, his understanding of distance and timing was poor, and his teaching method consisted mainly of shouting commands without providing the detailed explanations that would help students improve. Most disturbing, he treated his female students with barely concealed condescension, assigning them to practice forms while the male students learned more advanced techniques. The situation came to a head on a rainy Tuesday evening in October. Maria was walking past the dojo when she noticed a commotion inside. Through the windows, she could see Harrison berating a young woman who had apparently made an error during a sparring exercise. The student, probably in her early 20s with short blonde hair and the determined expression of someone who refused to give up despite constant discouragement, was standing at attention while Harrison lectured her about her supposed limitations. Women don't have the upper body strength for serious martial arts, Harrison was saying, his voice loud enough to be heard through the glass. You should focus on the basics. Maybe consider switching to something more appropriate like yoga or dance classes. This isn't a game, And frankly, you're holding back the other students who are here to learn real fighting techniques." The young woman's face was flushed with embarrassment and anger, but she maintained her composure. "Sensei Harrison, I've been training here for 2 years. I know I can improve if you'll just give me the same instruction you give the male students." Harrison's laugh was dismissive and cruel. "Improvement has limits. You've reached yours. I suggest you find a hobby that better suits your natural abilities." Maria felt something snap inside her chest, a surge of anger that connected directly to every rejection she had experienced, every door that had been closed in her face, every master who had dismissed her potential based on assumptions about her gender. For 30 years, she had channeled that anger into her training, using it as fuel for her relentless pursuit of excellence. Now watching another woman face the same dismissive treatment that had shaped her own journey, the anger demanded action. She pushed through the front door of the dojo without thinking about the consequences. The conversation stopped abruptly as everyone turned to look at the middle-aged woman in a rain-soaked coat who had just interrupted their class. Harrison frowned, clearly annoyed by the intrusion. "Excuse me, this is a private class," he said. "If you're interested in adult beginner programs, you'll need to make an appointment during regular business hours." Maria ignored him, walking directly to the young woman who was still standing at attention. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Sarah," the girl replied, confusion evident in her voice. "Sarah, how long have you been training here?" 2 years, ma'am," Maria nodded, then turned to face Harrison. "And in 2 years, what have you taught her about real martial arts?" Harrison's face reddened. "Look, lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to leave. This is my school, and I decide what gets taught here." "Your school," Maria repeated, looking around at the poorly maintained equipment, the motivational posters that had nothing to do with traditional martial arts values, the trophy case filled with awards from competitions that measured athletic ability rather than martial skill. "And what qualifications do you have to run a school?" "I'm a 3rd-degree black belt with 15 years of experience," Harrison replied, his voice rising. "I've trained under some of the best instructors in the Pacific Northwest, and I don't need to justify my credentials to some random woman who wandered in off the street." Maria smiled, the expression containing no warmth whatsoever. 15 years. Impressive. Tell me, in those 15 years, how many real masters have you studied under? How many hours have you spent learning traditional forms? How much do you understand about the mental aspects of martial arts, about the discipline required to achieve true mastery? The other students were watching the exchange with fascination, sensing that something unusual was happening but unable to understand exactly what. Harrison seemed unsure how to respond to questions that challenged the foundations of his authority. "I don't have to answer to you," he said finally. "You need to leave, or I'll call the police." "Before I go," Maria said, "perhaps you could demonstrate some of these superior techniques you've been teaching. Show me what 15 years of training looks like." The challenge hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Harrison realized that he was trapped. Refusing would make him look weak in front of his students, but accepting could lead to embarrassment if this strange woman proved to be more capable than she appeared. He looked her up and down, taking in her ordinary clothes, her slight build, her completely unthreatening appearance. "Fine," he said. "If you want a demonstration, I'll give you one. But when this is over, you leave and don't come back." Maria nodded and began removing her coat. Underneath, she wore the same simple clothes she always did: dark pants, comfortable shoes, a plain shirt that allowed for unrestricted movement. She pulled the wooden pins from her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders, and stepped onto the training mat with movements that were so fluid and natural that they barely registered as preparation for combat. Harrison assumed a fighting stance that would have been recognizable to anyone familiar with sport karate. Feet spread for stability, hands raised in a guard position, weight balanced for quick movement in any direction. It was textbook form. From the perspective of tournament competition, designed to score points while minimizing the risk of being scored upon. Maria simply stood, her posture relaxed but perfectly balanced, her hands at her sides, her breathing slow and controlled. To the untrained observers, she looked completely unprepared for what was about to happen. To someone with real martial arts knowledge, she looked like a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to release its energy. "Are you ready?" Harrison asked, already beginning to move forward. "I'm ready," Maria replied, her voice so calm it seemed to drain tension from the air around her. What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Falls for years to come, though most of the people who heard the story would never quite believe it. Harrison launched himself forward with a straight punch aimed at Maria's face, a technique he had probably used successfully hundreds of times against opponents who fought at his level. The strike was fast and powerful, backed by his considerable size advantage and years of training. Maria moved aside so minimally that Harrison's fist seemed to pass through the space where her head had been without her having to step or lean. The motion was so slight that observers couldn't tell whether she had moved at all, or if Harrison had simply missed his target. Before he could recover his balance, her hand touched his wrist with what looked like the gentlest possible contact. Harrison stumbled past her, off balance and confused. He spun around, his face red with exertion and embarrassment, and tried again with a combination of punches and kicks that represented the best techniques he knew. Maria responded by seeming to drift around him like smoke, never appearing to exert any effort, but somehow always being exactly where his attacks couldn't reach her. The third time Harrison rushed forward, Maria's response was different. Instead of evading, she stepped into his attack, her movement so precisely timed that she seemed to materialize inside his guard. Her palm struck his chest with what looked like a gentle push, but the impact sent him sliding backward across the mat until he collided with the wall on the far side of the room. Harrison slumped to the floor, gasping for breath that wouldn't come, staring at the woman who had just demonstrated that everything he thought he knew about martial arts was inadequate. Maria stood in the center of the mat, her breathing unchanged, her clothes not even wrinkled from the encounter. She turned to address the students who were watching in stunned silence. "Real martial arts are not about defeating opponents," she sighed. "They are about understanding yourself, developing discipline, and learning to use only the minimum force necessary to resolve a conflict. What you just saw was not a fight. It was a lesson about the difference between techniques and understanding." She looked directly at Sarah, the young woman who had been dismissed moments earlier. "Don't let anyone tell you that you have limitations based on your gender. The greatest masters I've known succeeded because they were willing to work harder and think more deeply than those who had natural advantages." Maria retrieved her coat and walked toward the door, pausing only to address Harrison one final time. "Your students deserve better instruction than you're capable of providing. Consider finding a qualified teacher to help you understand what you're missing." As she left the dojo, Maria felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. The satisfaction came from finally using her abilities for something meaningful, from defending someone who couldn't defend herself, from exposing the kind of fraudulent instruction that damaged the reputation of legitimate martial arts. Concern came from the realization that her carefully constructed cover had just been blown in the most public way possible. By morning, the entire town would know that the quiet tea shop owner had somehow defeated the local karate instructor. With techniques that defied explanation, questions would be asked, assumptions would be made, and the peaceful anonymity she had cultivated for 12 years would be gone forever. Whatever came next, Maria Chun's days as an invisible small-town shopkeeper were over. But as she walked through the rain toward her shop, she realized that she felt more alive than she had in years. For the first time since Master Takeshi's death, she had used her abilities for something that mattered. had stood up for principles that were larger than her own safety and comfort. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding from who she really was, and start finding ways to share the knowledge that had been denied to her for so long. The story of what happened at Mountain View Martial Arts that night would spread far beyond Cedar Falls, eventually reaching people who would recognize the techniques Maria had demonstrated and understand their significance. Within days, her quiet life would be complicated by visitors who had traveled across the country to meet the woman, who had displayed mastery that shouldn't have been possible for someone with no official training or credentials. But that was a concern for tomorrow. Tonight, she would practice her forms in the hidden dojo beneath her tea shop, moving through sequences that honored the memory of Master Takeshi and the traditions he had shared with her. She would prepare for whatever challenges were coming, knowing that her secret was no longer safe, but feeling, for the first time in years, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The news of what had happened at Mountain View Martial Arts spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire, transforming overnight from eyewitness accounts to local legend. By dawn, Maria's phone was ringing with calls from curious townspeople, reporters from regional newspapers, and martial arts practitioners from as far away as Portland, who had heard fragments of the story and wanted confirmation. She let them all go to voicemail, focusing instead on the morning routine that had anchored her life for 12 years, though she knew that routine was about to be permanently disrupted. The first sign of serious attention came at 8:15 a.m. when a black sedan with government plates pulled up outside her tea shop. Two men in conservative suits emerged, moving with the careful precision of federal agents or military personnel. They surveyed the street, noted the positions of security cameras, and approached her door with the systematic thoroughness of professionals conducting an operation rather than making the casual visit. Maria watched them through the shop's front window while continuing to prepare her morning tea service, her hands steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system. She recognized the type immediately: intelligence operatives, probably CIA or NSA, sent to investigate reports of martial arts abilities that exceeded the normal parameters of civilian training. Their presence meant that someone in the government was taking last night's demonstration seriously enough to warrant an official response. The lead agent was tall and lean with prematurely gray hair and the kind of stillness that came from extensive training in surveillance and interrogation. His partner was younger, broader, with the alert posture of someone accustomed to providing physical backup when conversations turned dangerous. Both men moved like they had military backgrounds, probably special forces veterans who had transitioned into intelligence work after completing their service obligations. They entered the shop without ceremony, the older agent producing a leather credential case that identified him as Agent David Morrison, Central Intelligence Agency. His partner remained unnamed, positioning himself near the door in a way that blocked the exit while appearing to simply browse the tea selection displayed on nearby shelves. "Miss Chun," Morrison said, his voice carrying the neutral tone of someone trained to extract information without revealing anything about his own agenda. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about an incident that occurred last evening at a local martial arts school." Maria continued arranging tea canisters on the counter, her movements unhurried and natural. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Agent Morrison. Perhaps you could be more specific about the nature of your inquiry." Morrison pulled out a tablet and swiped to a video file that showed security camera footage from the building across from Mountain View Martial Arts. The image quality was poor, but it clearly showed her entering the dojo, the brief confrontation inside, and her departure minutes later. What it didn't show was the actual demonstration of her abilities, leaving room for interpretation about what had really happened. "Several witnesses reported that you engaged in some kind of physical altercation with the instructor Robert Harrison," Morrison continued. "According to their statements, you displayed martial arts techniques that were described as, quote, impossible and unlike anything they had ever seen." We're here to verify these claims and understand where you might have acquired such training. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond simple curiosity. Maria understood that her answer would determine whether she was classified as a potential asset or a potential threat, whether the government's interest in her would be benevolent or hostile. The wrong response could result in detention, interrogation, or worse. "Agent Morrison," she said carefully, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about what actually occurred. Mr. Harrison was behaving inappropriately toward one of his female students, and I intervened to address the situation. Any physical contact was minimal and defensive in nature." Morrison's expression didn't change, but his partner shifted position slightly, moving closer to the counter in a way that reduced the distance between him and Maria. The subtle adjustment confirmed her suspicion that they were prepared for this conversation to escalate beyond words if necessary. "Ms. Chun, we've spoken with Harrison himself, and he's unable to explain how you were able to, in his words, throw him across the room without seeming to touch him. He also mentioned that your movement patterns were unlike anything in his experience with martial arts, suggesting training that goes well beyond civilian instruction." Maria poured hot water over tea leaves, the familiar ritual helping her maintain composure while calculating her options. The truth would invite scrutiny that could destroy the life she had built, but lies would be easily detected by professionals trained in deception recognition. Her best strategy was to provide partial honesty while concealing the full extent of her capabilities. "I studied martial arts when I was younger," she said, which was technically accurate. "Self-defense classes mainly. When I saw Mr. Harrison mistreating that young woman, I acted on instinct to protect her. Perhaps Mr. Harrison's account has been influenced by embarrassment about being challenged by someone he perceived as unthreatening." Morrison made a note on his tablet, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her explanation. "Where did you receive this training?" "We've been unable to find any records of formal martial arts instruction associated with your name." The question revealed more than Morrison probably intended. If they had already searched for official records of her training, they had moved beyond casual inquiry into active investigation. Someone with significant authority had ordered them to compile a comprehensive background assessment, which meant her demonstration had attracted attention from people who understood the implications of advanced martial arts skills. "It was many years ago," Maria replied. "Small schools in San Francisco, places that probably aren't in business anymore. I'm afraid I don't remember many details about instructors or documentation." The younger agent finally spoke, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that suggested military service in regions where special operations were common. "Ma'am, we've reviewed your background extensively. You have no military service, no law enforcement experience, no documented connection to any martial arts organization. Yet multiple witnesses described abilities that typically require decades of intensive training under expert instruction. We're hoping you can help us understand this discrepancy." Maria felt the familiar sensation of being trapped between truth and necessity, the same feeling that had driven her to create her false identity in the first place. These agents represented the same institutional thinking that had rejected her as a young woman. The assumption that extraordinary abilities must come through official channels, that real skill could only be validated by credentials and documentation. "Gentlemen," she said, setting down her teacup and meeting Morrison's gaze directly, "I appreciate your thoroughness, but I'm afraid I can't provide the kind of detailed training history you're looking for. What happened last night was an unfortunate situation that got out of hand. I'd prefer to put it behind me and return to my normal life." Morrison exchanged a look with his partner, a silent communication that confirmed they had anticipated this response. "Ms. Chun, we're not here to cause problems for you. In fact, depending on your background and capabilities, we might be able to offer opportunities that would make better use of your skills than running a tea shop in a small town. The offer carried undertones that made Maria's skin crawl. She had heard similar promises before, from people who wanted to exploit unusual abilities for purposes that had nothing to do with the martial arts, values she had spent her life pursuing. The government's interest in her was almost certainly connected to their need for individuals capable of handling situations that required extraordinary physical capabilities combined with the ability to operate without official oversight. "I'm quite content with my current life," she replied firmly. "I have no interest in opportunities that would take me away from my business or my community." Morrison's smile was thin and calculating. "Of course. But circumstances have a way of changing, don't they? For instance, we've discovered some interesting irregularities in your business licensing, tax records, and immigration documentation. Nothing serious, you understand, but the kind of inconsistencies that might warrant closer examination by the appropriate authorities." The threat was delivered with bureaucratic politeness, but its message was clear: cooperate or face consequences that could destroy everything she had built. Maria felt anger rising in her chest, the same fury that had driven her to confront Harrison the night before, but she forced it down. Losing control now would only confirm their suspicions about her capabilities and provide justification for more aggressive action. "What exactly are you asking of me?" she said. "Nothing immediate," Morrison replied. "Simply an understanding that if situations arise where your particular skills might be useful, you'd be willing to consider consulting with us. Think of it as a professional courtesy between individuals who serve the greater good in different capacities." Maria understood the euphemism. They wanted her available for operations that required someone capable of violence who could be disavowed if things went wrong. The kind of work that destroyed souls and left operatives with nothing but empty official gratitude and classified burial sites when their usefulness expired. "I'll need time to consider your proposal," she said. Morrison nodded, producing a business card with only a phone number printed on expensive stock. "Take all the time you need, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this have a tendency to become less attractive the longer they remain open." After the agents left, Maria locked the shop's front door and retreated to her basement dojo, needing the familiar environment to process what had just occurred. The government's interest in her meant that her demonstration at Mountain View martial arts had been far more significant than she had realized. Someone with access to intelligence resources had identified her abilities as potentially valuable for operations that required extreme discretion and capability. The implications were staggering. If federal agents were investigating one incident in a small Oregon town, they were probably monitoring martial arts communities nationwide, looking for individuals whose skills exceeded normal parameters. Her years of careful anonymity had been shattered by a single moment of moral conviction, exposing her to scrutiny that could fundamentally alter her existence. She moved through a series of meditation forms, trying to center herself enough to think clearly about her options. Refusing the government's offer would invite continued harassment and possible retaliation against her business and community. Accepting would mean becoming part of a system that valued her abilities while disregarding the principles that had guided her development of those abilities. The phone in her shop began ringing again, interrupting her contemplation. She climbed the stairs and checked the caller ID, expecting another journalist or curious townsperson. Instead, she saw a number she recognized from her past, one that shouldn't have existed anymore, according to everything she had been told. "Wei," she answered in Mandarin, using the formal greeting Master Takeshi had taught her decades ago. "Maria-chan," came the reply, spoken in heavily accented English by a voice she hadn't heard in over 20 years. "Or should I call you Quiet Thunder, as you were known in the old days?" The nickname hit her like a physical blow. Only 3 people had ever called her that: Master Takeshi, an elderly woman named Grandmother Liu, who had taught her herbal medicine in Chinatown, and the man who was now speaking to her across impossible distances of time and secrecy. "Chen Wei-ming," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're supposed to be dead." "As are you, according to most official records," he replied. "Yet here we both are, very much alive and apparently attracting the same kind of unwanted attention from people who don't understand what they're dealing with." Chen Wei-ming had been Master Takeshi's senior student before Maria, a young man whose abilities had been legendary even among the underground martial arts community of 1980s San Francisco. He had disappeared suddenly during her third year of secret training, and Master Takeshi had told her only that Wei-ming had been forced to leave the country due to political complications that made his continued presence dangerous for everyone involved. "How did you find me?" she asked. "The same way the government agents found you. Your demonstration last night was captured on multiple devices and uploaded to social media platforms before the authorities could suppress it. Within hours, it was being analyzed by people who recognized the techniques you were using." Maria felt her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. If amateur video had captured enough detail for identification by people familiar with advanced martial arts, her secret was no longer limited to government intelligence agencies. She was now exposed to anyone with the knowledge to recognize what they were seeing and the resources to act on that recognition. "How many others know?" she asked. "Enough to make your current situation untenable," Wei-ming replied. "There are people looking for you who make federal agents seem benevolent. By comparison, people who remember the old networks, the schools that existed before commercialization and politics, corrupted everything we valued." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the shop's front door, the sharp authoritative sound of someone accustomed to having their demands answered immediately. Through the window, Maria could see a group of men in expensive martial arts uniforms, their bearings suggesting they were masters or senior instructors from established schools. Their presence so soon after her exposure meant they had traveled significant distances to reach her, probably departing within hours of seeing the video footage. "Wei-ming, I have to go," she said. "There are people here." "Be careful, Quiet Thunder. Not everyone who seeks you out has honorable intentions. I'm sending you an address. If you need help, if the situation becomes more than you can handle alone, come there. But bring everything you value with you, because you may not be returning to Cedar Falls." The line went dead, leaving Maria alone with the sound of increasingly insistent knocking. She looked through the window again, counting at least 6 men ranging in age from their 30s to their 60s, all carrying themselves with the confident posture of serious martial artists. Their uniforms bore insignia from schools she didn't recognize, but their coordinated arrival suggested they represented some kind of organization rather than acting as individuals. The leader of the group was a man in his 50s with the lean build and alert eyes of someone who had spent decades refining his combat abilities. When he saw her looking through the window, he smiled and bowed formally, the gesture containing both respect and challenge in equal measure. His companions arranged themselves in a semicircle behind him, creating a formation that would allow them to respond quickly if the situation turned physical. Maria unlocked the door, knowing that attempting to avoid the confrontation would only delay the inevitable while making her appear weak or afraid. These men had traveled too far and invested too much effort to be turned away by simple refusal to engage with them. "Miss Chun," the leader said, his English precise despite a slight accent that suggested Japanese origins. "My name is Hiroshi Matsumoto, and I represent the Traditional Arts Preservation Society. We've come a very long way to speak with you about last night's demonstration." The name meant nothing to her, but the formality of his introduction and the presence of his companions suggested they represented legitimate martial arts authority rather than government agents or casual enthusiasts. Maria stepped aside to allow them entry, noting how each man moved with the fluid economy of motion that marked advanced practitioners. Please forgive the unannounced visit, Matsumoto continued as they arranged themselves in her shop seating area. But the video footage of your encounter with the local instructor has raised questions that require immediate clarification. He produced a tablet and played a video that made Maria's heart sink. Unlike the poor quality security camera footage the government agents had shown her, this recording had been shot by someone inside the dojo using a high-definition camera. Every detail of her movement was captured in crystal clarity. The minimal adjustments that allowed her to evade Harrison's attacks, the precise timing of her defensive responses, and most damaging, the advanced techniques she had used to end the confrontation. These techniques, Matsumoto said, pausing the video at the moment when her palm strike sent Harrison sliding across the room, are from a very specific lineage of internal martial arts. The footwork, the breathing patterns, the way you generate power through whole-body integration rather than muscular force, all of this indicates training in methods that are rarely taught outside of China and never to outsiders without decades of proof of worthiness. Maria remained silent, understanding that anything she said would be analyzed for clues about her background and training methods. Matsumoto was clearly an expert who could identify subtle details that would be invisible to casual observers, including federal agents who lacked deep martial arts knowledge. More significantly, he continued, the internal energy cultivation evident in your movements suggests study under a master of extraordinary ability. There are perhaps a dozen people alive today capable of teaching these methods, and most of them have been accounted for. We're very curious about who provided your instruction. One of the younger men in the group leaned forward, his expression intense with barely controlled excitement. Master Matsumoto, the breathing pattern she uses in the final technique is identical to the crane reflex moon form from the Wudang internal system. But that form has been lost for over 40 years. Matsumoto nodded gravely. Indeed. Which raises the question of how Ms. Chin learned something that shouldn't exist anymore, from teachers who shouldn't have had access to such knowledge. The weight of their collective attention felt like a physical pressure. These men represented the kind of traditional martial arts community that Maria had always longed to be part of. Practitioners who understood the true depth and complexity of the arts she had devoted her life to mastering. But their interest in her was complicated by suspicion and the competitive dynamics that had always plagued relationships between different schools and lineages. Ms. Chun, Matsumoto said, we don't wish to interrogate you or expose secrets that you've chosen to keep private. However, the techniques you demonstrated represent knowledge that belongs to specific traditions with long histories and careful preservation methods. If you have access to lost forms or methods, there are obligations that come with that knowledge. Maria understood the subtext. In traditional martial arts culture, advanced techniques were considered treasures that belonged to entire lineages rather than individual practitioners. Someone who possessed rare knowledge had a responsibility to ensure its preservation and transmission to worthy students. By keeping her abilities secret, she was potentially allowing valuable methods to die with her. What obligations? She asked. Teaching, replied an elderly man whose white beard and serene expression marked him as a senior master. The techniques you possess were developed over centuries by countless practitioners who sacrificed their lives to refine and preserve them. They weren't meant to be hoarded by individuals, but shared with those capable of carrying the traditions forward. The suggestion contained both opportunity and trap. Teaching would allow her to honor the knowledge Master Takeshi had shared with her, to pass on methods that might otherwise be lost forever. But it would also require her to reveal the full extent of her abilities, to submit to the authority of traditional martial arts hierarchies that might not accept her unconventional background. I'm not qualified to teach, Maria said. My training was incomplete, informal. I lack the credentials and lineage authority that serious instruction requires. Matsumoto smiled for the first time since entering her shop. Ms. what we witnessed last night was not the work of someone with incomplete training. Your techniques were flawless, your understanding profound, your application effortless. Whatever methods you used to acquire these abilities, the results speak for themselves. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where a few townspeople were beginning to gather, drawn by curiosity about the unusual. Visitors, there is a tournament, he said. An annual gathering of traditional schools that takes place in different locations around the world. This year, it will be held in the mountains of Northern California at a facility that has been used for such purposes for over a century. One of his companions continued the explanation. The tournament serves multiple purposes: preserving ancient forms, testing applications under controlled conditions, and identifying practitioners worthy of advanced instruction. It's also where we determine which lineages retain custody of specific techniques and training methods. Maria felt a chill of understanding. They weren't just inviting her to participate in a friendly competition. They were challenging her to prove her worthiness to possess the knowledge she had demonstrated, with the implicit threat that failure would result in demands to reveal her sources and surrender her training methods to more qualified custodians. What would be expected of me? She asked. Matsumoto returned to his seat, his expression serious. Demonstration of your complete abilities against opponents, chosen to test specific aspects of your training. Forms competition to verify your understanding of traditional methods. And most importantly, exhibition matches against masters from established lineages to determine the true extent of your capabilities. The prospect was both terrifying and exhilarating. For 30 years, Maria had trained in isolation, never able to test her abilities against opponents of equal skill, or to measure her progress against objective standards. The tournament would provide the ultimate validation of everything she had worked to achieve, but it would also expose her to dangers that went far beyond physical injury. If I refuse? She asked. Then you remain under suspicion of possessing stolen or improperly acquired knowledge, Matsumoto replied. And you continue to attract the kind of attention that makes peaceful anonymity impossible. The truth of his statement was evident in the growing crowd outside her shop. Word of the unusual visitors had spread through the small town, and people were gathering to observe the mysterious meeting taking place in their quiet tea merchant's establishment. Among the curious townspeople, Maria noticed the black sedan that had brought the government agents, its occupants undoubtedly monitoring her interaction with the martial arts masters. Her carefully constructed life was disintegrating in real time, torn apart by forces she couldn't control or escape. The demonstration that had felt like moral necessity was revealing itself to be the trigger for consequences that would reshape her existence, whether she wanted them to or not. When is this tournament? She asked. 3 weeks, Matsumoto replied. Enough time for you to prepare, to consider what you're willing to reveal about your background and training methods, but not enough time for outside interference to complicate the situation. The warning was clear. Others were interested in her abilities, people who might prevent her from attending the tournament if they had sufficient time to act. The government agents she had met that morning were probably only the beginning of official attention that could result in detention, recruitment, or worse. Matsumoto stood and bowed formally, his companions following suit. We'll provide you with the location and details when you've made your decision. But Ms. Chun, understand that your demonstration last night has made neutrality impossible. You will either prove yourself worthy of the knowledge you possess, or you will face the consequences of its misuse. After they left, Maria stood alone. In her shop, surrounded by the familiar sights and smells that had anchored her life for over a decade. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like fragments of a world that was already disappearing. Outside, the crowd was beginning to disperse, But she could see people pointing at her building, discussing the mysterious visitors who had traveled so far to meet with someone they had always considered an ordinary shopkeeper. Her phone rang again, the display showing Agent Morrison's number. She let it go to voicemail, knowing that whatever message he left would only increase the pressure for her to make decisions that would serve other people's interests rather than her own. The government wanted to use her abilities for operations. That violated everything she believed about martial arts. The traditional schools wanted to judge her worthiness based on standards she had never agreed to accept. But buried beneath the fear and anger was something else: excitement. For the first time since Master Takeshi's death, she had the opportunity to test herself against opponents worthy of her abilities, to discover whether her unconventional training had produced skills that could stand up to traditional methods refined over centuries. The tournament represented validation she had never imagined possible, a chance to prove that dedication and natural ability could overcome the barriers that had once excluded her from serious instruction. The decision was made before she fully realized she was making it. Maria walked to the shop's front door and turned the sign to closed, then pulled down the shades that would give her privacy for what she needed to do next. In 3 weeks, she would face the greatest challenge of her martial arts career, competing against masters whose abilities were legendary, even within the secretive world of traditional fighting arts. But first, she had to prepare for a different kind of challenge, escaping the attention of people who would prevent her from reaching the tournament if they understood what it represented. The game of hide-and-seek that had defined her adult life was about to become far more dangerous, with stakes that extended beyond her personal safety to include the preservation of knowledge that had taken centuries to develop. As evening fell over Cedar Falls, Maria began the preparations that would allow her to disappear from one life and emerge into another, leaving behind the peaceful anonymity of Rachel Torres to embrace whatever destiny awaited quiet thunder in the mountains of Northern California. The mountain facility where the tournament was held existed in a space between worlds, hidden deep in the Northern California wilderness where cellular signals died and GPS coordinates led only to empty forest. Maria had followed a series of increasingly cryptic directions that took her off highways, down dirt roads, and finally along a trail that seemed to have been carved by animals rather than machines. The location's isolation was deliberate. What happened here needed to remain invisible to outside observation, protected from interference by governments or media, organizations that wouldn't understand the significance of what they were witnessing. The compound itself was a masterpiece of camouflaged architecture, buildings that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. Traditional Japanese construction techniques had been adapted to local materials, creating structures that blended seamlessly with the surrounding redwood forest. Only the subtle geometric patterns of rooflines and the precisely maintained gardens revealed human presence to someone who knew what to look for. Maria arrived 3 days before the tournament's official beginning, as Matsumoto had suggested, to acclimate herself to the environment and observe the other participants as they prepared for competition. The early arrivals were a cross-section of the world's most accomplished traditional martial artists, elderly masters whose reputations were legendary even among practitioners, middle-aged instructors who had dedicated their lives to preserving specific lineages, and younger fighters whose abilities had earned them recognition despite their lack of formal credentials. The diversity was staggering. She observed an elderly woman from Taiwan practicing Bagua Zhang forms that seemed to bend space around her movements, an African-American man whose adaptation of classical boxing techniques incorporated elements she had never seen before, and a group of Brazilian practitioners whose capoeira had evolved far beyond its folkloric origins into something that resembled combat meditation. Each tradition represented centuries of refinement, knowledge systems that had survived persecution, commercialization, and the general decline of interest in anything requiring serious dedication. The tournament structure became clear during the orientation meeting held in the compound's main hall, a vast space with exposed beams and walls lined with weapons that had been used in previous competitions. The event was divided into 3 categories: forms demonstration, which tested understanding of traditional techniques and principles; application competition, which involved controlled combat against opponents from different lineages; and the Masters Exhibition, reserved for practitioners whose abilities transcended normal competitive categories. Matsumoto, who served as one of the tournament's senior organizers, explained the rules with the gravity of someone conducting a religious ceremony. "This is not sport competition," he emphasized. "These are tests of understanding, preservations of knowledge that might otherwise be lost, and opportunities for different traditions to learn from each other. Victory and defeat are less important than the demonstration of authentic martial arts principles." Despite the philosophical language, Maria could sense undercurrents of serious competition among the participants. Schools that had maintained rivalry for generations would have opportunities to settle old disputes. Masters whose theories had been questioned would be able to provide practical demonstrations, and practitioners like herself, whose credentials were questionable, would either prove their worthiness or be exposed as frauds. The government's interest in the tournament was evident in the sophisticated surveillance equipment concealed throughout the compound, devices that recorded everything despite the organizers' assurances of privacy and discretion. Maria recognized the technology from her encounter with Agent Morrison: high-definition cameras disguised as natural features, audio pickups sensitive enough to capture conversations from hundreds of yards away, and probably satellite monitoring of anyone entering or leaving the area. Her first challenge came not from an official opponent, but from a young man named David Kim, whose credentials included multiple championships in international taekwondo competition and a reputation for adapting traditional techniques for modern combat applications. He approached her during evening practice session, when most participants were working privately on their preparation routines. "You're the woman from Oregon," he said, not bothering with formal introductions. "The one who threw around that karate instructor like he was a child." Maria continued her stretching routine, noting Kim's confident posture and the way he positioned himself to block her retreat from the practice area. His approach was calculated to create pressure, to force her into either backing down or accepting an informal challenge that would reveal her capabilities before the official competition began. "I'm here for the same reason as everyone else," she replied. "To learn and to share knowledge with serious practitioners." Kim's smile was predatory. "Really? Because I think you're here to prove that your mysterious training methods are legitimate. Problem is, there are people here who've spent their entire lives mastering traditional arts, and they don't appreciate outsiders claiming to possess ancient secrets without being able to prove their lineage." The challenge was delivered with enough volume to attract attention from other practitioners in the area, creating an audience that would make backing down appear cowardly. Maria understood that this was a deliberate test, probably coordinated with other participants who wanted to assess her abilities before the formal competition. Her response would set the tone for everything that followed. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. Kim gestured toward an open area of the practice hall where several other participants had gathered to watch. "Friendly demonstration. Traditional forms first, to see if you actually understand classical techniques. Then maybe some light sparring, just to get a sense of how you apply your training." Maria knew that accepting would mean revealing capabilities she had planned to keep hidden until the official matches, but refusing would confirm suspicions that her abilities were exaggerated or fraudulent. The audience included masters whose opinions would influence how she was treated throughout the tournament, making this informal challenge potentially more important than any formal competition. She moved to the center of the designated area and assumed the opening position for one of the internal forms, Master Takeshi had taught her decades ago. The sequence was deceptively simple in appearance, consisting of slow, flowing movements that emphasized breathing, balance, and the cultivation of internal energy. To untrained observers, it would look like gentle exercise. To experts, every detail would reveal the depth of her understanding. The form unfolded with mathematical precision, each transition flowing naturally into the next while maintaining perfect structural alignment. Her breathing integrated seamlessly with the movements, creating a visible rhythm that seemed to draw energy from the earth itself. By the halfway point, the gathered practitioners had fallen completely silent, recognizing something extraordinary in the execution of techniques they thought they understood. When she completed the sequence, the silence stretched for several seconds before an elderly Chinese master named Professor Chun began a slow, deliberate applause that was taken up by others in the group. Kim's confident expression had been replaced by uncertainty as he realized that he had challenged someone whose abilities exceeded his understanding. "Very impressive," he said, his voice lacking its earlier aggression. "Your form work is obviously at a high level, but forms and fighting are different things." Maria nodded, understanding that the real test was just beginning. "What parameters did you have in mind for sparring?" Kim gestured to one of the senior masters, seeking guidance about appropriate rules for their impromptu match. The response came from Professor Chun, whose authority was evident in the way other participants deferred to his judgment. "Traditional challenge format," the old man said. "Contact allowed, but control required. Victory by clean technique, loss of balance, or acknowledgement of defeat. Master Masimoto will serve as referee." The rules created a framework that favored skill over strength, technique over aggression. Maria appreciated the structure, which would allow her to demonstrate her abilities without causing injury or creating unnecessary animosity with someone she might face again in formal competition. Kim assumed a fighting stance that blended taekwondo's mobile footwork with boxing hand techniques, a hybrid approach that had proven effective in sport competition. His guard was tight, his movement fluid, and his distance management suggested thousands of hours of sparring experience against skilled opponents. Maria simply stood, her posture relaxed but perfectly balanced, her hands at her sides in apparent violation of every defensive principle Kim had been taught. To the observers, she looked completely unprepared for what was about to happen. To Kim, her stillness was unnerving, suggesting confidence that bordered on arrogance. Matsumoto signaled the beginning of the match, and Kim immediately launched a combination of kicks and punches designed to test Maria's defensive reactions. His techniques were fast, precise, and powerful enough to end the match immediately if they connected cleanly. Maria's response was to seem to flicker out of existence, reappearing slightly to one side of Kim's attack path as if she had never moved at all. His combination struck only empty air, leaving him overextended and confused about where his opponent had gone. Before he could recover, her hand touched his shoulder with what appeared to be gentle contact. The touch sent Kim stumbling sideways, his balance completely disrupted by forces he couldn't understand. He spun to face her again, his expression shifting from confidence to concern, as he realized that nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for this type of opponent. His second attack was more cautious, probing strikes designed to test her reactions rather than seeking immediate victory. Maria responded by moving like water, flowing around his techniques while maintaining perfect distance and timing. Occasionally, she would make contact with strikes so light they seemed like casual touches, but each one disrupted his balance or interrupted his combinations in ways that left him increasingly frustrated. The match continued for several minutes, with Kim growing more aggressive and Maria becoming increasingly elusive. It was becoming clear to the observers that they were witnessing a demonstration of internal martial arts, principles that transcended normal competitive categories. Maria was fighting without fighting, controlling her opponent through superior understanding rather than superior force. The end came when Kim, desperate to land a significant technique, committed fully to a jumping kick that would have been devastating if it connected. Maria stepped forward into his attack zone, her movement timed so perfectly that she seemed to materialize inside his guard. Her palm struck his chest with the same gentle contact she had been using throughout the match, but this time the result was different. Kim landed hard on his back, the impact driving the air from his lungs and leaving him staring up at the ceiling in complete bewilderment. Maria stood over him, her hand extended to help him up, her expression showing no triumph or satisfaction at his defeat. "Thank you for the practice," she said as she helped him to his feet. "Your techniques are very strong. With some adjustment to your timing and distance management, they would be even more effective." The grace with which she handled victory impressed the observing masters more than her technical abilities had. In traditional martial arts culture, how someone behaved after defeating an opponent revealed more about their character than the techniques they used to achieve victory. Maria's response demonstrated the kind of humility and respect for opponents that marked authentic martial artists. Professor Chun approached as the crowd began to disperse, his ancient face wearing an expression of deep thoughtfulness. "Ms. Chun," he said, using the formal address that indicated respect rather than familiarity, "your demonstration this evening has answered some questions while raising others. Your technical abilities are unquestionable, but your lineage remains mysterious." Maria understood that she was being invited to provide more information about her background, to satisfy the curiosity that her performance had generated among the tournament's most senior participants. The truth would be difficult for them to accept, but continued evasion would create suspicions that could undermine everything she hoped to accomplish. "Professor Chun," she said, "my training was unconventional. I learned through observation and self-instruction rather than formal apprenticeship. The techniques you observed come from many different sources, synthesized through years of solitary practice." The old man's eyebrows rose slightly, the first expression of surprise she had seen him display. "Self-instruction? You're claiming to have achieved this level of mastery without direct teaching from qualified masters." "Not entirely without teaching," Maria clarified. "I received guidance from someone who preferred to remain anonymous, someone who provided written instruction and occasional feedback, but who could not offer formal recognition of my progress." Professor Chun was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what she had told him. In traditional martial arts culture, idea of someone achieving master-level abilities through informal instruction was almost heretical. The system was built on direct transmission from teacher to student, with lineage authority passing through carefully documented chains of succession that extended back centuries. "This explains much about your approach," he said finally. "Your techniques show influences from multiple traditions, integrated in ways that would be impossible for someone trained within a single lineage. But it also raises questions about your right to possess knowledge that belongs to specific schools and families." The comment contained a warning that Maria had been expecting since her arrival at the compound. Traditional martial arts communities were intensely protective of their methods, viewing advanced techniques as inheritance that should only be passed to worthy successors within established hierarchies. Someone like her, who had acquired knowledge through unconventional means, represented a threat to systems that had governed martial arts instruction for generations. "I understand the concerns," she said. "I've never claimed to represent any particular tradition or to possess authority that wasn't earned through legitimate channels. I'm here to learn, to share what I've discovered through my own practice, and to honor the knowledge that was freely given to me." Professor Chun nodded slowly. "We shall see what the formal competition reveals about your understanding and your intentions. But Ms. Chun, understand that there are those here who view your presence as disruption of proper order. They will test you in ways that go beyond technical ability, seeking to determine whether you deserve the respect that your skills would normally command. The warning proved prophetic over the following days as Maria found herself subjected to increasingly aggressive challenges from participants who resented her unconventional background. Masters from established schools questioned her understanding of philosophical principles, demanded detailed explanations of her training methods, and suggested that her abilities were flukes rather than products of genuine martial arts development. The most serious challenge came from Sensei Nakamura, a 7th-degree black belt in traditional Shotokan karate, whose family had operated the same dojo in Kyoto for over 200 years. His credentials were impeccable, his technique flawless, and his understanding of classical karate principles was considered definitive by experts worldwide. More importantly, he had devoted his career to preserving traditional methods against contamination by modern sport competition and commercial instruction. "Miss Chun," he said during the evening meal that preceded the tournament's final day, "I've observed your demonstrations with great interest. Your abilities are impressive, but they lack the spiritual foundation that defines authentic martial arts. Technique without proper lineage transmission is merely physical exercise, regardless of how skillfully it's performed." The criticism was delivered in front of the entire assembly, creating a public challenge that demanded response. Maria understood that Nakamura was speaking for a significant faction of participants, who viewed her as an interloper whose presence diminished the tournament's legitimacy. "Sensei Nakamura," she replied, "I have great respect for traditional transmission methods and the masters who have preserved ancient knowledge through proper channels. But I would suggest that the spirits of the martial arts are found in their principles rather than their pedigrees. Someone who embodies those principles through dedicated practice honors the arts regardless of how they acquired their understanding." Nakamura's expression darkened. Principles without proper teaching become distorted, personal interpretations that corrupt the pure methods developed by our predecessors. You may have natural talent, but talent without guidance produces incomplete understanding. "Then perhaps," Maria said, "you would be willing to help me understand where my training has been inadequate. I would welcome the opportunity to learn from someone with your depth of experience." The response transformed the confrontation into a formal challenge, creating exactly the situation Maria had hoped to avoid. But Nakamura's public questioning of her legitimacy had left her no choice except to either defend herself or acknowledge that her abilities were insufficient for serious recognition. "Very well," Nakamura said. "Tomorrow's Masters exhibition will provide an appropriate venue for such education. I look forward to demonstrating the difference between authentic karate and improvised technique." The final day of the tournament dawned clear and cold, with early morning mist rising from the valleys below the mountain compound. Maria spent the hours before competition in meditation, centering herself for challenges that would test everything she had learned over 3 decades of secret practice. The Masters exhibition was reserved for the tournament's most accomplished participants, practitioners whose abilities had earned them recognition as inheritors of classical traditions. The format was simple. Individual demonstrations followed by challenge matches between volunteers from different schools. Victory was determined by a panel of senior masters whose judgment was considered final and unappealable. More important than winning or losing was the demonstration of authentic martial arts principles under pressure, the revelation of each participant's true understanding of the arts they claimed to represent. Maria's demonstration was scheduled for mid-morning after several other masters had presented their specialties to the assembled audience. She had chosen to perform a sequence that combined elements from multiple internal styles, techniques that would showcase the synthesis Master Takeshi had taught her while avoiding direct copying of any single tradition. When her name was called, she moved to the center of the exhibition area with the same calm presence she had maintained throughout the tournament. The audience included not only the tournament participants, but also observers from martial arts organizations around the world. people whose opinions would influence how traditional communities viewed her for years to come. The form she performed was poetry in motion, a seamless blend of power and grace that demonstrated perfect integration of mind, body, and spirit. Her breathing was audible throughout the hall, creating a rhythm that seemed to pulse with natural forces. Her movements were so precise that they created geometric patterns in the air, invisible shapes that spoke to the mathematical foundations underlying all effective martial arts. When she finished, the silence was profound and extended. Even her critics among the audience recognized that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a level of mastery that transcended normal competitive categories. The applause, when it finally came, was led by Professor Chun and taken up by masters, who had initially questioned her right to participate in the exhibition. Nakamura's demonstration followed immediately, a display of classical Shotokan kata that was flawless in every detail. His technique showed the refinement that came from generations of careful transmission, the perfection that resulted from training within established systems, guided by masters who had devoted their lives to preservation of authentic methods. The contrast with Maria's unconventional approach was stark and deliberate. The challenge match was announced as the day's final event, framed not as competition between individuals, but as dialogue between different approaches to martial arts. Mastery. The rules were traditional. Full contact allowed, victory by knockout, submission, or acknowledgement of defeat. Master Masumoto would referee, with the panel of senior masters serving as final arbiters of the outcome. As they faced each other, in the center of the exhibition area, Maria and Nakamura represented more than personal rivalry. They embodied the tension between traditional authority and individual achievement, between established systems and innovative adaptation, between the preservation of ancient knowledge and its evolution for modern application. Nakamura's opening attack was a perfect example of classical karate technique, linear, powerful, and delivered with the timing and distance management that had been refined over centuries of practical application. His reverse punch was aimed at Maria's solar plexus with enough force to end the match immediately if it connected cleanly. Maria's response was to disappear from the attack's path, seeming to melt away from Nakamura's technique while simultaneously moving into position for her counter. Her movement was so fluid that observers couldn't determine exactly how she had avoided the strike. But suddenly she was beside Nakamura rather than in front of him, her hand poised inches from his ribs. Instead of striking, she stepped back and assumed a neutral position, allowing him to reset and attempt another technique. The gesture was both merciful and provocative, demonstrating her ability to end the match while choosing not to do so. Nakamura's second attack was more complex, a combination of hand and foot techniques designed to cut off Maria's escape routes and force her to engage directly with his superior strength and reach. His execution was flawless, his timing perfect, his power sufficient to overwhelm any normal defensive response. Maria met the attack by flowing through the spaces between Nakamura's techniques, moving with the kind of three-dimensional awareness that seemed to bend the normal rules of physics. She appeared to pass through his combination without being touched, emerging behind him with her hands positioned for strikes that could have damaged vital points throughout his body. Again, she chose not to attack, instead stepping away and allowing Nakamura to recover his position. But this time, her restraint seemed to anger rather than humble him. His face reddened with frustration as he realized that his best techniques were being neutralized by someone who seemed to be playing with him. His third assault was driven by emotion rather than strategy, a furious combination of attacks that sacrificed precision for overwhelming aggression. Maria responded by meeting his energy directly, her movements becoming sharp and decisive as she shifted from defensive to offensive mode. The exchange that followed was over in seconds, but seemed to stretch through eternity for those watching. Maria flowed around Nakamura's attack and struck 3 pressure points in rapid succession, her touches so light they appeared gentle, but so precisely placed that they disrupted his nervous system's ability to maintain balance and coordination. Nakamura collapsed to his knees, his body betraying him despite his will to continue fighting. Maria stood over him, her hand extended in the same gesture of respect she had shown to every opponent throughout the tournament. "Thank you for the lesson, Sensei," she said as she helped him to his feet. "Your techniques are masterful, and your dedication to preserving traditional methods is admirable. I hope my unconventional approach has provided some useful insights for your own practice." The response demonstrated the same grace and victory that had marked all of her interactions throughout the tournament, but its impact was multiplied by the significance of her opponent and the methods she had used to defeat him. She had faced the most accomplished traditional master present and prevailed using techniques that honored classical principles while transcending their normal limitations. Professor Chun rose from his position among the judges, his ancient face wearing an expression of profound respect. "Miss Chun," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall, "you have demonstrated that authentic martial arts mastery can emerge from unconventional paths when guided by proper principles and dedicated practice. Your technical abilities are matched by your character, and your understanding of the art's true purposes has been proven under the most demanding conditions." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "The Traditional Arts Preservation Society would be honored to recognize you as a legitimate inheritor of the knowledge you possess, regardless of how you acquired it. More importantly, we would welcome your participation in our efforts to preserve and transmit these arts to future generations." The offer represented everything Maria had hoped for when she first decided to attend the tournament: recognition from the martial arts community, validation of her unconventional training methods, and the opportunity to share knowledge that might otherwise be lost. But it also represented a fundamental change in her life, a transition from hidden practice to public teaching that would expose her to scrutiny and responsibility she had never sought. The government agents who had been monitoring the tournament would undoubtedly interpret her recognition by traditional masters as confirmation that her abilities warranted recruitment for operations that served state interests rather than martial arts principles. The commercial dojos that dominated modern martial arts instruction would view her as either a threat to their market position or an opportunity for exploitation through association with her reputation. Most significantly, accepting the role of teacher would require her to make the same kinds of difficult decisions about student selection and knowledge transmission that had shaped her own journey. She would have to determine who was worthy of advanced instruction, which techniques should be shared freely and which required years of character development before transmission, and how to balance preservation of traditional methods with evolution for modern application. But as she looked around the hall at masters whose respect she had earned through demonstration rather than credentials, at students whose eyes showed the hunger for authentic knowledge that had driven her own development, and at traditions that had survived centuries of persecution and neglect through the dedication of individuals willing to sacrifice personal comfort for larger purposes, Maria knew that her choice was already made. "Professor Chun," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had marked Master Takeshi's instruction decades earlier, "I would be honored to contribute to the preservation of these arts, but I would want to do so in ways that honor both traditional methods and the innovative approaches that emerge when dedicated practitioners are forced to find their own paths to mastery." The response drew nods of approval from masters who understood that martial arts evolution required both preservation and adaptation, tradition and innovation, established authority and individual achievement. Maria had demonstrated that excellence could emerge from unconventional sources when guided by authentic principles and sustained by uncompromising dedication. As the tournament concluded and participants began their journeys back to schools and communities around the world, Maria found herself facing a future dramatically different from anything she had imagined. The quiet tea shop owner who had hidden her abilities for over a decade was gone, replaced by someone who would help shape how traditional martial arts adapted to modern challenges while maintaining their essential character. The government agents would continue their attempts at recruitment, but now she had allies within the international martial arts community who could provide protection and legitimacy that federal authorities would be reluctant to challenge directly. The commercial schools that had rejected her as a young woman would now seek association with someone whose abilities had been validated by the most demanding traditional standards. Most importantly, she would finally have the opportunity to honor Master Takeshi's memory by transmitting the knowledge he had shared with her to students who demonstrated the character and dedication necessary for authentic martial arts development. The circle that had begun with her rejection by established schools would close with her acceptance as a guardian of the traditions she had spent her life mastering. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.